acertar con la precisión que sabe.
Mr. President, there must be a reason for the delay. Mozambique and Algeria. All others like still continue justice for others. Global justice. It was great.
The 9,704th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestine question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and South Africa to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invites the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Ms. Rosemary Carlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Lisa Dotin, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary Carlo.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, once again, the Council is coming together to discuss alarming developments and increasing tensions in the Middle East. The devastating Israeli attack on the El-Tibin school in Gaza City, which prompted this meeting, points once again to the desperate need to reach a ceasefire, free the hostages, and scale up humanitarian aid to Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces airstrike in the Al-Tibin school compound took place early on 10 August. It killed dozens of Palestinians and wounded many others, including women and children, according to local Palestinian sources. The Secretary General condemned the continued loss of life in Gaza following another attack on a school sheltering hundreds of displaced Palestinian families. According to Israel, the IDF targeted a Hamas command center and a mosque inside the school compound and killed at least 31 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters. As the Secretary General underlined yesterday, international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack, must be upheld at all times. Also yesterday, Hamas announced the killing of a hostage and serious injury of two others by Hamas militants while in captivity in Gaza. Both sides have stated they are looking into the incidents. Mr. President, with hostilities continuing across the Strip, including in the north around Gaza City, in the middle area in Khan Yunis, and in and around Rafah, the situation remains catastrophic for civilians. No place is safe in Gaza, yet civilians continue to be ordered to evacuate to ever-shrinking areas. My colleague, Director Dotin, from OCHA will brief you shortly in more detail regarding the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza. 10 months since the start of the war, the threat of further regional escalation is more palpable and chilling than ever. Exchanges of fire across the blue line have continued nearly daily. Since I last briefed on 31 July, numerous projectiles have been fired from Lebanon across the blue line, causing damage to buildings and bushfires in open areas. The IDF has responded with strikes across the blue line into southern Lebanon. Uncrewed aerial vehicles crossing the blue line from southern Lebanon have also continued. An IDF base was hit across the blue line, while another base was hit near Nahariya in northern Israel. An open area in Nahariya city was also struck. Mr. President, I urge continued attention to the worsening situation and ongoing violence in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. On 3 August, the IDF said it conducted 2 airstrikes on a Hamas cell in Tulkarem, killing 9 Palestinians who the IDF said were planning to conduct an attack inside Israel. Separate IDF operations in Jenin and Tubas early last week also killed another 16 Palestinians. On 11 August, a shooting attack claimed by Hamas killed 1 Israeli civilian and wounded another in the northern Jordan Valley in the occupied West Bank. Another Palestinian shooting attack, near Qalqilia, reportedly injured 1 Israeli and 2 Palestinians. The assailant, who was claimed by Hamas as an Al-Qassam Brigade's commander, was subsequently killed by ISF. Mr. President, if the slide towards an even greater catastrophe is to be halted, the parties must end all escalatory rhetoric and actions. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for all to work vigorously towards regional de-escalation in the interest of long-term peace and stability. I welcome efforts by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to bring both sides to conclude a deal to bring about a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and desperately needed humanitarian relief. As the leaders of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States emphasized in their joint statement on 8 August, and I quote, "There is no further time to waste, nor excuses from any party for further delay," end quote. Their call for immediate relief to the people of Gaza and the hostages and their families must be heeded. I urge all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and promptly conclude this deal as endorsed by the Security Council in Resolution 2735. The United Nations is committed to supporting all efforts towards this goal and remains in close contact with the relevant parties. Mr. President, the killing, destruction, and suffering in Gaza must end. The hostages must be reunited with their families. But even as efforts to achieve these goals continue, we cannot lose sight of what we consider indisputable. In the absence of a clear path towards a future in which Israelis see their legitimate needs for security materialize, and Palestinians see their legitimate aspirations for a fully independent, viable, and sovereign state realized, lasting peace in the Middle East will remain elusive. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Carlo for briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Dotin.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council. Here we are again in the aftermath of yet another horrendous episode in this brutal war in Gaza. Like Undersecretary General Carlo, we're deeply horrified by the strike on Al-Tabayin school in Ad-Daraj by Israeli forces on Saturday. The school was sheltering several hundred displaced families, many of whom had moved there because of recent evacuation orders. And the strike was conducted during dawn prayers. Initial reports suggest this was one of the deadliest attacks on a school sheltering displaced people since the start of this conflict. Tragically, this is far from an isolated incident. Indeed, such attacks appear to be occurring with increasing frequency. The most recent incidents include 3 schools hit within 48 hours between 3 and 4 August, and 2 schools hit on 8 August, all in Gaza City, with Al-Tabayin on Saturday, the latest such attack. According to OHCHR, this is at least the 21st strike on a school that has been serving as a shelter recorded since 4 July this year. Scores of people have been killed in these strikes, among them women and children. Mr. President, sadly, these large-scale incidents are only some of the myriad ways in which this horrendous conflict is causing unbearable suffering and devastation. Unremitting violence in Gaza has now killed almost 40,000 Palestinians and injured more than 90,000 others, according to the Gaza Ministry of Health. Some 10,000 people remain unaccounted for and are thought to be buried under the rubble. And as of 9 August, an estimated 115 hostages remain captive in Gaza, despite repeated demands for their release, including hostages who have been declared dead and whose remains are in Gaza. The health situation in Gaza remains critical and the healthcare system is barely functional, providing brave but limited support for the injured and the sick, for the women in childbirth, and against rapidly spreading disease. Thousands of patients in critical conditions are on waiting lists for medical evacuations. More than 60% of residential buildings and 65% of the road network have been damaged or destroyed, according to UN recent analysis. In just 2 weeks, more than 250,000 people have been displaced, often on multiple occasions. Evacuation orders, supposedly for civilian security, are clearly having the opposite outcome. Civilians are repeatedly asked to evacuate to areas where essentials for their survival are absent. They're repeatedly being killed and injured in the very places they've been told were safe to go. Shelters and displacement camps are reportedly used for military purposes by Palestinian armed groups, exposing those sheltering there to terrible danger. Overcrowding in these places is putting immense strain on already severely stretched water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. Acute respiratory infections, diarrheal illnesses, acute jaundice syndrome, and skin infections are all surging. And, very worryingly, with school immunization programs practically impossible, polio looms as a new threat after 6 circulating poliovirus strains were detected in environmental samples in June. As a matter of urgency, health workers must be allowed to carry out an immunization campaign. This war is destroying lives, dreams, and futures. More than 500,000 students have lost an entire academic year, with 39,000 students missing their final exams. Even if this war were to end today, we estimate that at least 8 in 10 schools would require rehabilitation. And we must not discount the immense emotional and psychological trauma this war has had on children, indeed, people of all ages, trauma they will carry for the rest of their lives. It bears repeating, there's no protection of civilians in Gaza. Alongside the relentless mass displacement within Gaza, many thousands of Palestinians have left and many more are trying to. As this conflict persists and lives are threatened daily, civilians must be allowed to seek protection. Those displaced must also be guaranteed the right to voluntarily return. What we're seeing in Gaza is the result of a war waged with pitiful, if any, regard for the requirements of international law. I share the Secretary General's and others' deep concern about violations of international humanitarian law being committed throughout this conflict. Mr. President, in the middle of the spiraling catastrophe in Gaza, the humanitarian community doggedly continues efforts to mount an effective response. We do what we can to increase food assistance, provide education support, and boost hospital capacity. Efforts are also ongoing to avert the spread of polio. And senior UN officials continue discussions with stakeholders, including senior Israeli officials, to increase the flow of aid into the Gaza Strip and improve conditions for the delivery on the ground. However, as things stand, access constraints and high levels of insecurity severely hamper the humanitarian response. Aid entering Gaza has more than halved since the Rafah ground operation began, and Rafah crossing was abruptly closed in early May. New limits imposed by Israeli authorities on bringing cash to Gaza are significantly limiting the resources available for operations. Fuel shortages mean water supplies have fallen as low as 2 liters per person per day, far below the 15 liters required. Organized crime and looting along the route used by humanitarians dispatching cargo from Kerem Shalom crossing continue to hinder aid delivery. Access to people in need remains a challenge. The increase in bureaucratic and administrative impediments, such as delays in visa issuance and renewals for broader operational support and management, is severely impacting the response. And our concerns for the safety of staff keep growing, with attacks on or near aid vehicles that have been coordinated on the rise. Recently, within a 12-day period, there's been 4 shooting incidents involving UN convoys, including on a vehicle carrying children on their way to be reunited with their father. NGOs and the Palestinian Red Crescent all report similar attacks. The result is that hundreds of thousands of people are not getting the life-saving humanitarian assistance they so desperately need. Mr. President, how much longer can this continue? How many more tragedies, such as the one in Al-Tabim school, must happen before action is taken. Can this Council look at the children, the people of Gaza, and all those affected by this war in the eye, as humanitarian workers have to do every single day, and swear that no stone has been left unturned to end their suffering? The urgent requirements, so often repeated, remain the same. First, an immediate cessation of hostilities and sustained ceasefire. Secondly, strict adherence to international humanitarian law by all sides. This entails releasing all hostages. It also entails protecting civilians and meeting their essential needs, including by ensuring the unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance throughout Gaza, as ordered by the International Court of Justice, including through UNRWA. And lastly, we have said before in this context, all member states must use all of their leverage to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law, including through diplomatic and economic pressure, and conditioning arms exports on compliance with the rules of war and cooperation in combating impunity. We must remember that this is now one of the several conflicts in Gaza over the years which humanitarians have had to respond to. Conflicts that the population in Gaza was never afforded the ability to recover from or repair. The past 10 months have destroyed what little hope for a future existed for any surviving child. I urge this Council and all member states to use your influence to protect civilians and bring an end to this conflict and its intolerable toll. It's imperative that mutual security and lasting peace is pursued so that hope can be restored, so that civilians there can enjoy the hope that we take for granted and the hope that they have never experienced. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Dotin for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statement. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, I thank USG, Mrs. Rosemary Di Carlo, and OCHA Director, Mrs. Lisa Dotin, for their briefing. I will start my statement by the same question of Mrs. Dotin. How long? Is it going to be yet another ineffective, vain, and hopeless meeting of the Security Council? Are we going to count and count the number of deaths in Gaza? The answer is simple. This is neither what the Council is designed for, nor what the international community expects from us. More importantly, this is not how the Council should address the Palestinians' plea, the Palestinians' quest for justice, the Palestinian right to exist. Our Council has the legal and moral primary responsibility to act, and to act firmly, to shoulder its mandate in preserving international peace and security. Mr. President, for 311 days, our Council has been constantly fooled and disregarded, while an entire population has been subjected to a collective punishment. Last Saturday, the world woke up to yet another horrific bloodshed after the Israeli occupying power targeted deliberately a school in a Daraj neighborhood in Gaza. It was the third school bombed in 2 days. It was a civilian structure, sheltering civilians by the testimony of the international community. Our Secretary General said it clearly. The school was sheltering hundreds of displaced Palestinian families. The Euromed Humanitarian Rights Monitor also stressed that the school was nothing but a dilapidated place that hundreds of families have taken refuge in. These testimonies of one of the survivors is harrowing. A father said that he has been given 18 kilogram of body parts, and he buried them as the body of his young son. Mr. President, this heinous massacre of Ad-Daraj and the previous ones wouldn't have been possible without the generous financial and military assistance freely provided to the Israeli aggressor. More than 100 innocent lives were sacrificed in Ad-Daraj, among them women and children, in addition to the nearly 40,000 Palestinian martyrs so far. Were these martyrs not human? With their dreams, with their hopes, as we all do? Is the Council's role limited to keeping a record of lost lives? Again, the answer is simple. Our Council must, and now, fulfill its responsibilities and honor its commitment. Its responsibility to tackle the root cause of the Palestinian question, which is the illegal occupation of the Palestinian land. Its responsibility to hold the occupying power accountable using all legal means, including sanctions. Yes, sanction mechanism. Third, its commitment to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East and to prevent the dangerous escalation provoked by the Israeli occupying power. Mr. President, the Israeli occupying power continue to defy the very commitment of this Council, made in Resolution 2735, calling for the implementation of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Immediate ceasefire in Gaza. This resolution is seriously jeopardized by the intensifying aggression of the Israeli occupying power against Gaza. Algeria warns against this continuing sabotage of effort made by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to implement this resolution urgently and effectively. In this regard, Algeria expresses again its support for the mediation effort made by these three countries. There is no room for delaying or over-complicating negotiation by adding new conditionalities or new demand. Engaging in good faith in the initiative of President Biden is paramount to achieving the long-awaited ceasefire. Mr. President, for the sake of humanity's value, we must act now. Our inaction is costing life and jeopardizing the destiny of a whole people, the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you for organizing this urgent meeting as requested by Algeria. I also want to thank Undersecretary General Carlo as well as Director Dotin for their briefings today. Mr. President, this Saturday, the world was once again shell-shocked by another devastating airstrike in Gaza, one of the deadliest ones yet. Slovenia strongly condemns the Israeli attack on Al-Tabin school in central Gaza City, in complete disregard for the fate of Palestinian lives. There are serious claims that Hamas is embedding itself among the civilian population in civilian infrastructure. We strongly condemn such actions. Hamas must stop sacrificing their fellow Palestinians and putting them in mortal danger. On the other hand, we are horrified by the series of military attacks on schools that we have witnessed recently. We repeat our call for full respect of international law, including Security Council Resolution 2601. Just yesterday, we marked 75 years of Geneva Conventions, which are being seriously tested these days in Gaza and in other conflicts. Slovenia is gravely concerned about the potential for tensions to spiral further out of control into a broader regional conflict, with devastating consequences beyond Gaza's borders. We call for maximum restraint by all actors in the region to prevent us from going down a road of no return. There is an urgent need to refrain from further attacks and threatening rhetorics. Colleagues, the resolution this Council needs to focus on as a priority is 2735. We express our full support to the mediators and their call on both sides to conclude talks on a ceasefire and the release of hostages and prisoners. In this regard, we call on both sides to resume the negotiations this week. We call on both sides to commit to concluding the deal without delay. It has been more than 2 months since the Council demanded a ceasefire. We have been patiently waiting for the implementation of our resolutions. Meanwhile, we have been witnessing a continuation of deadly attacks and civilian casualties. And we have been observing Palestinians being chased across Gaza. There is no more time to spare. There are no more innocent lives to be wasted. We once again propose that the Council establishes a clear deadline for the conclusion of the deal. In this interim period, a pause in the fighting should be observed, a pause that would allow for humanitarian aid to be delivered at scale and for polio vaccinations to be administered safely. We welcome the efforts of WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA in outlining plans for 2 rounds of polio vaccination. If a deal is, however, not reached, this Council should, without delay, discuss how to ensure compliance with its resolutions in the face of immense suffering in Gaza. And indeed, as Director Dotin said, we should not leave any stone unturned. Mr. President, yesterday a journalist asked me how many more briefings this Council needs to start changing the situation in Gaza. Indeed, we are receiving briefings so that we can take action. We adopted 4 resolutions, but we never followed up on their implementation. The time for action is now. It is time for ceasefire to be finally reached, or else it is time for this Council to ensure it finally happens. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend Algeria for requesting this meeting. We praise Sierra Leone's presidency for convening this urgent briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We are grateful to Ms. Rosemary Carlo, Under Secretary General, and Ms. Lisa Dotin, a representative of OCHA, for their briefing to the Council. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East has been causing devastating consequences and an unacceptable toll on children, women, and the civilian Gazan population at large. The latest killings took the lives of more than 100 Palestinians. It is imperative that urgent efforts be undertaken in order to address and stop these killings. We are deeply concerned over the Israelis' continuous airstrikes against civilian infrastructures that include schools, hospitals, and shelters, thus inflicting on them severe damage. In this connection, we wish to remind once again that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute a grave violation of international law and international humanitarian law. And this is particularly disturbing as we celebrate this year the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. We call on all those who sincerely believe in the obligations arising from the premises of responsibility to protect, to ensure that this doctrine is swiftly and coherently applied to Gaza's situation. On the other hand, indiscriminate military attacks can only aggravate regional conflicts and trigger new conflicts that will gain a larger dimension. Unimaginable implications for regional and international peace and security could ensue. Given the gravity of the situation, it is imperative that all parties involved, particularly Israel, comply with international legal norms and agreements. In particular, they must abide by all orders and judgments enacted by the International Court of Justice on the matter. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to this war. We urge the parties to implement without reservation and without further delay all Security Council resolutions that we have taken on this conflict. As advocates of peace, security, and humanitarian aid, it is crucial that we underscore the importance of raising awareness about these heartbreaking events described by our briefers. Mr. President, we hold the view that resolving this conflict in the Gaza Strip and Palestine requires approach encompassing negotiations. This approach must include plans for economic development, humanitarian aid, reconstruction of Gaza, and regional collaboration. These are the necessary steps that will pave the way towards a lasting and sustainable peace. We therefore embrace the move for a concerted global action to end Israel's military operation in Gaza, which is expanding exponentially with the untold suffering of the Palestinian people. In this context, Mozambique reaffirms its commitment to supporting all diplomatic efforts aimed at finding sustainable solution to the protracted conflict in the Gaza Strip and Palestine. We reiterate our full support for the ongoing diplomatic efforts by the United States of America, Egypt, Qatar, and other Arab countries, as well as the international community at large, in pursuit of a lasting solution to the protracted conflict in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, Mozambique remains steadfast in our recognition of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, political independence, and sovereignty, as prescribed by the Charter of the United Nations and the dictates of international law. We reiterate the urgent need for the implementation of a two-state solution, a solution based on the existence of two independent and sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, both as members of the United Nations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Undersecretary General Carlo and Director Dotin from OCHA for their briefings. President, the UK is appalled by the Israeli military strike on Al Tabeen School, where Palestinian civilians were sheltering. The UN tells us this strike killed dozens of Palestinians, many of whom are reported to be women and children. Sadly, this was not the only Israeli strike on schools turned shelters we have seen. There were 17 such attacks in July alone. Palestinians have nowhere safe to turn. 86% of Gaza is now under evacuation orders. And in recent days, we've seen some of the largest orders to date. impacting tens of thousands of people, displaced multiple times over. Families are forced to move back and forth, but with none of these places offering the safety or security they so desperately need. On top of that, some of these orders have been issued by Israel in the middle of the night, with minimal notice to allow civilians to flee. Israel must ensure it complies with its obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. The UK is also horrified by the reports of sexual violence and abuse faced by the hostages in Gaza and Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli detention, many of whom are children. Hamas must release all the hostages immediately. Hamas must also stop endangering civilians. And Israel must grant the ICRC access to prisoners immediately and ensure accountability if anyone is found to be responsible for the abuse of detainees. We have also heard completely unacceptable rhetoric from Israeli ministers relating to the mistreatment of detainees and starvation of civilians in Gaza. We call upon the government of Israel to retract and condemn these remarks. International law could not be more clear. Systemic mistreatment of detainees and the international starvation of civilians are war crimes. President, another deadly threat is on the horizon for the people of Gaza. They stand on the precipice of a polio outbreak, with 600,000 children under the age of 8 in desperate need of vaccinations. We call on the parties to cooperate urgently with the World Health Organization to facilitate vaccine rollouts and ensure the safety of humanitarian workers. We call on Israel to allow unfettered aid access into Gaza and to put in place an effective deconfliction mechanism to ensure aid can be delivered safely. Finally, President, I reiterate the UK's call for regional de-escalation, as my Prime Minister made clear in his call with Iranian President Pezeshkian last night. Thanks to the tireless efforts of the US, Qatar, and Egypt, there is a ceasefire deal on the table for Gaza. My Prime Minister joined with his French and German counterparts to urge the parties to resume discussions on 15 August and get the deal done. We need an immediate ceasefire. We must get the hostages out, get much more aid in, and move quickly towards a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席先生，我感谢阿尔及利亚倡议召开此次会议，感谢迪卡洛副秘书长和道顿司长的通报。上周，以色列袭击加沙塔宾学校，夺去了上百名无辜平民的生命，中方予以强烈谴责。平民及民用设施不能成为军事行动的目标，这是国际人道法规定的红线。有大量平民聚居的学校一而再、再而三地遭到袭击，这种行为令人发指。在过去10个月里，加沙100万民众家园被毁，亲人离散，他们被迫从一个地方转移到另一个地方，为的是寻找一处安宁的角落。但等待他们的还是无差别的轰炸和随时降临的死亡。现在的加沙已经没有安全之地。汉尤尼斯曾被以色列宣布为所谓安全区，现在那里的民众又面临新的轰炸袭击，被迫逃离。绝望的加沙民众期待知道战争的终点在哪里，活下去的希望在哪里。 立即实现持久停火是加沙民众的迫切期盼，也是国际社会压倒性共识。美国在2个月前推动安理会第2735号决议时，声称以色列已经接受停火协议，但现实却恰恰相反。我们没有看到以色列致力于停火的可信迹象，反而是不断扩大的军事行动，不断攀升的平民死伤。美国作为最大的武器供应方，对以色列有足够的影响力。我们希望美国拿出真诚、负责任的行动，推动以色列尽早停止在加沙的军事行动，停止对平民的杀戮。主席，加沙人道灾难持续恶化，饥饿、疾病快速蔓延。近日，以色列高层政治人物称，让200万加沙民众饿死是合理且合乎道德的。这种骇人听闻的言论完全不可接受。饥饿不能成为武器，人道问题不能政治化，平民生命不能成为谈判的筹码。中方敦促以色列履行国际人道法义务，开放全部过境点，保障人道物资快速、大规模、安全准入。世界卫生组织正在开展针对加沙儿童的脊髓灰质炎疫苗接种计划，这对遏制大规模传染病、保护儿童健康至关重要。以色列应该保护相关医疗工作者的安全和行动自由。约旦河西岸局势动荡加剧，令人担忧。我们对以色列士兵对巴勒斯坦被扣押人员实施性虐待事件表示严重关切，呼吁进行调查和追责。中方敦促以色列立即停止一切定居点活动，切实遏制愈演愈烈的定居者暴力，停止侵蚀两国方案的基础。我们重申，两国方案是解决巴以问题的唯一可行出路。中方支持巴勒斯坦实现独立建国，倡议召开更大规模、更具权威、更有实效的国际会议。主席，加沙冲突的负面影响加速扩散，中东地区局势已经岌岌可危。但与此同时，不负责任的挑衅冒险行径仍在频繁发生，我们对此深感忧虑。中方重申，避免局势恶化升级的关键在于尽快实现加沙全面持久停火。中方愿同国际社会一道，为早日平息加沙战火、缓解人道灾难、落实两国方案、实现中东长治久安做出不懈的努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you also, Undersecretary General Carlo and Director Dotin, for your very sobering briefing. We continue to support the United Nations' vital, albeit difficult to implement, humanitarian efforts in Gaza. The United States is deeply concerned about reports of civilian casualties following the August 10th strike by the IDF on the compound in Gaza that included a school and a mosque, sheltering desperate, displaced people, including women and children. We have raised our concerns with Israel, and while they indicated they were targeting senior officials from Hamas and Palestinian Jihad, they have an obligation to do everything possible under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. We mourn every civilian lost in this horrific incident and in this conflict. But this much we do know and must be acknowledged. Hamas continues to gather and continues to operate out of schools with no regard for the well-being of civilians. Israel has a right to pursue Hamas. Israel has a right to respond to threats, but how it does that matters. We've said repeatedly and consistently that Israel must take measures to minimize civilian harm. Colleagues, I cannot stress enough President Biden's view that it is time to bring immediate relief to the long-suffering people in Gaza and the long-suffering hostages and their families. The best way to do that is a ceasefire in Gaza with a hostage deal. The United States, alongside Qatar and Egypt, has worked tirelessly for months to forge the framework agreement on the table, with only the details of implementations to be concluded. A framework based on the principles endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735. Simply put, the deal needs to get done now. Now. As President Biden emphasized in a statement last week with leaders of Qatar and Egypt, and I quote, "There is no further time to waste nor excuses from any party for further delay. It is time to release the hostages, begin the ceasefire, and implement this agreement," unquote. We've called on both sides to resume urgent discussion on Thursday, August 15th in Doha or Cairo to close all remaining gaps and commence implementation of the deal without further delay. As mediators, we are prepared to present a final bridging proposal, one that resolves the remaining implementation issues in a manner that meets the expectations of all parties. We welcome the statements of support for this effort, such as the one issued by Algeria over the weekend, and we call on every member of this Council to speak with one voice, to press Hamas to participate in the discussions on August 15th, and for both sides to agree to implement the deal on the table without further conditions or delays. A durable ceasefire could accelerate efforts to restore basic services, including electricity and water and sanitation, bringing much-needed relief to Palestinian civilians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times. It could enable an urgently needed vaccination campaign to stop the spread of polio, and it would facilitate the release of all hostages held by Hamas, including 8 Americans and citizens from many other countries. We also have been clear that a ceasefire in Gaza could help enable diplomatic efforts to restore calm along the Blue Line and reduce regional tensions. Indeed, from the start of this conflict between Hamas and Israel, the United States has worked to avoid a situation in which the fighting in Gaza spirals into a broader regional conflict. 4 months ago exactly, on April 13th, the United States worked closely with Israel and our partners in the region to repel Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel and stave off a broader conflict. Now we're once again in a moment of heightened threat. Consequently, the United States has taken needed precautionary steps, including moving an aircraft carrier group and additional air assets to the region so that should the situation arise again, we are prepared to defend Israel and U.S. military personnel in the region against any threats. But let me be clear, our deployment of additional military assets are not a prediction of what is to come. A broader regional conflict is not inevitable. The United States' overall goal remains to turn the temperature down in the region, deter and defend against any future attacks, and avoid regional conflict. That starts with finalizing a deal for an immediate ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza. We need to get this over the finish line. Again, we urge every member of this Council to say clearly and unequivocally that it is time to finalize and implement this agreement. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG Carlo and Director Dotin for their briefings. The number of civilian casualties and the degree of suffering we have seen in Gaza for more than 300 days of conflict are unbearable and distressing. Today, this urgent meeting is convened following yet another grave incident. Japan expresses its deep concern over the loss of many civilian lives and injuries caused by the Israeli airstrikes on Al-Tabin school last Saturday. It is appalling that numerous civilian casualties have occurred in schools and hospitals. All parties must strictly abide by relevant principles of international law, especially the protection of civilians. We urge Israel to make every effort to avoid civilian harm. Mr. President, Gaza is truly in agony. Nearly 1.9 million people are forcibly displaced due to the repeated evacuation order by Israel, fleeing again and again to places where life is barely tenable. Japan is deeply worried about the significant shortage of food, medicine, fuel, and other basic necessities in Gaza. We strongly condemn the deplorable remark by an Israeli cabinet minister. Starving more than 2 million Palestinians in Gaza cannot be justified. The detection of polio and the spread of such diseases is a man-made problem stemming from the collapse of the waste management system and is another matter of serious concern. The Rafah crossing must be reopened and the safety of aid workers must be assured at all times. Israel must lift all impediments to humanitarian assistance, not only to provide the minimum of survival, but also to protect human dignity. Mr. President, the still unfolding tragedy confirms that three things that this Council called for in Resolution 2735 must be achieved now without any further delay, namely, an immediate ceasefire, the release of all remaining hostages, and the expansion of aid delivery across Gaza at scale. In this vein, Japan appreciates the vigorous diplomatic push by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to close all remaining gaps to finalize the deal on the ceasefire and hostage release. We strongly support the recent joint leaders' statement and the effort made by the three countries, and we urge all parties concerned, especially Hamas, to constructively engage at the proposed meetings later this week and immediately work towards concluding the deal. This Council and the entire international community must remain united to end this crisis immediately. Japan will play its part in close cooperation with relevant stakeholders. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting in response to the timely request made by the delegation of Algeria. I also thank Under Secretary General Carlo and Ms. Dotin of OCHA for the information provided. Mr. President, the attacks on the Al-Tabin school are part of an ongoing pattern employed by the Israeli Defense Force since the beginning of the war in Gaza. It is a pattern characterized by a complete disregard for the humanitarian principle of proportionality, and it results over and over again in the killing of a high number of civilians on the pretext of eliminating one or more military targets. The Al-Tabin incident joins a growing list of similar incidents and one can expect this pattern to continue unless there are meaningful measures to stop the Israelis from continuing this senseless massacre of the Palestinian people. Guyana condemns in the strongest terms the ongoing violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, that manifest in the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on Israel and all parties to the conflict to abide by their obligations under international law and to end the hostilities against the people of Palestine. Mr. President, 10 months of Israel's unrelenting and unprecedented assault against the Palestinian people in Gaza have created a tragedy of such cruel proportions that it is difficult to find anything comparable in modern history. The death toll is approaching 40,000, with women and children overrepresented in this number. People are starving and living in the most inhumane conditions imaginable, with virtually no access to medicine and health care. Polio has now been detected in wastewater in Gaza, placing unvaccinated children at risk. Again, it is the children of Gaza that will suffer the most if an outbreak is not prevented. What else can we expect, though, when there is one toilet for 600 people living in shelters? Council members are all aware that the World Health Organization is ready to send more than 1 million polio vaccines to Gaza, targeting 600,000 children. In the words of the Director General, and I quote, "The WHO needs absolute freedom of movement for health workers and medical equipment to carry out these complex operations safely and effectively. A ceasefire, or at least days of tranquility during preparation and delivery of the vaccination campaigns, are required to protect children in Gaza from polio." End of quote. Guyana supports the WHO's plans to tackle this problem and appeals to the Israeli government to provide the relevant authorizations and to ensure the conditions to facilitate the vaccination campaign. This is a humanitarian imperative and a legal and moral obligation. Mr. President, Guyana has watched with keen horror the Israeli strategy of making Gaza a thoroughfare of destruction. The images coming out of Gaza shows a moonscape, yet what those images do not show is the problem of unexploded ordnances, which, according to one commentator, makes Gaza a literal ticking time bomb. Even after the hostilities end, these will present a real danger that could possibly take years to address. Mr. President, shall we speak also of the severe psychological trauma that this war has brought on, and which Ms. Dotin referred to? The constant bombings, multiple displacements, sight and smell of death, dismemberment, harassment, and other indignities can only be expected to have a heavy mental toll on civilians. Shall we also speak of the harrowing accounts of Palestinian civilians detained in Israel? The torture, including sexual violence, to which they are subject is illustrative of a level of depravity and debauchery that should never find expression among the agents of a civilized nation, more so a United Nations member state. But all of this represents the occupying power executing its colonialist aspirations, fueled by a racist and religious ideology of superiority that allows it to treat Palestinians as inferior. It is an ideology that promotes the subjugation of the Palestinian people. This is the reason that Israel's response to 7th of October has been so over the top. It is to pummel the Palestinians into relinquishing any aspiration to freedom and self-determination. It is part of the wider strategy that we are also witnessing in the occupied West Bank, characterized by the ongoing illegal settlement activity and the accompanying violence under the watchful and encouraging eyes of the Israeli security forces. This Council has a responsibility to end the impunity with which Israel has been carrying out its atrocities against the Palestinian people. It flies in the face of everything that the United Nations is built on: peace and security, human rights, and sustainable development. We cannot allow this to continue. Mr. President, it has been more than 2 months since this Council passed Resolution 2735, endorsing the efforts of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, for which we thank them. Since then, 2,600 more Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, and over 7,000 more injured. Ms. Dotin asked how long. We ask how many more. We stress again the obligation of the parties to implement the provisions of Resolution 2735, to reach a deal for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, and for adequate humanitarian assistance to reach the people of Gaza. We also underline the obligation of Israel to abide by the ICJ orders, mandating that Israel takes the necessary steps to protect Palestinian lives and well-being and prevent genocide. In closing, Mr. President, implementation of the two-state solution is way overdue and is the only viable path to peace. It is an injustice to the Palestinian people and to the people of the Middle East generally that peace appears to be a chimera, owing to Israel's dogged agenda to deny Palestinians their right to live in freedom and dignity in their own state. Guyana urges the Council to act to end this injustice. Guyana is prepared to do its part. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Carlo and Director Dotin of OCHA for their detailed briefing on the current situation in Gaza. The entire globe is anxiously watching the precarious situation in the Middle East. A series of destabilizing incidents have continued all across the region, including along the Blue Line, Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Beirut, and in the Red Sea. As repeatedly stressed in this chamber, the Republic of Korea reiterates its urgent calls for maximum restraint by all parties in the region. We strongly oppose any action that may trigger another cycle of violence and counter-violence, as this would only further endanger the lives of innocent civilians throughout the region. We are appalled and gravely disturbed by the repeated attacks against the civilian infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and shelters in Gaza, and especially by the August 10th strike on a mosque inside the Al-Tabain school, where around 100 people were reportedly killed. This was Israel's 8th bombing of a school sheltering civilians so far in August alone. We are all aware that civilian infrastructure should not be targeted. This is all the more so when those schools are being used as shelters for desperate civilians who have been displaced multiple times amid ongoing hunger, insecurity, and disease. Israel argues that these attacks on Al-Tabain school were carried out using precise munitions to eliminate Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad members embedded in the compound. But regardless of this argument, a fact is a fact. Yet another school, where hundreds of civilians were sheltering, was intentionally targeted. Israel claims that 31 terrorists were eliminated, but in this indiscriminate airstrike, no distinction was made between militants and civilians, including women and children. We understand Israel has numerous challenges in fighting against Hamas, but it is our belief that once again a school filled with displaced civilians was bombed by an advanced country like Israel. International humanitarian law must be observed at all times. As the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights clearly pointed out, the potential co-location of Hamas with civilians, as well as non-compliance with international law by Hamas, which we strongly condemn does not negate Israel's obligations under international law. Killing militants cannot justify killing civilians, including children. This is the unambiguous conclusion of international humanitarian law. As such, Hamas must not endanger civilians by using them as human shields. Yet at the same time, we urge Israel to take every possible measure to protect innocent Palestinian civilians. We are also disturbed by last month's OHCHR report, as well as media reporting, detailing that the rights of Palestinian detainees have been violated through arbitrary detentions and ill treatment. Mr. President, we are seriously alarmed by the exacerbating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Spreading famine has been compounded by the total destruction of law and order and repeated evacuation orders by the IDF. We urge Israel to implement all possible measures to enhance the swift and safe delivery of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza at scale. Humanitarian workers, notably UNRWA's, must be protected and their activities should be ensured. We are, however, appalled by the announcement last week that the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services found at least 9 UNRWA staff members may have been involved in the October 7th attack. UNRWA should maintain its role as the core pillar of humanitarian efforts in Gaza. Its credibility and neutrality must be ensured. Mr. President, the situation in the Middle East simply cannot continue along this dangerous trajectory of escalation. The conflict in Gaza must end immediately. In this regard, we welcome the joint statement by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, calling for the resumption of the negotiations on August 15th. Hamas must take part in the talks. Israel also should stick to the conditions elaborated in Security Council Resolution 2735. Urgent ceasefire should be followed by humanitarian aid distributed at scale and reinvigorated efforts towards a two-state solution. We hope all leaders in the region make the right de-escalatory decisions, rejecting the extremist voices bent on additional bloodshed. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Благодарим заместителя генсекретаря ООН по политвопросам и миростроительству Розмари Ди Карло, а также директора отдела по финансированию Управления ООН по координации гуманитарных вопросов Лизу Доутин за обстоятельные доклады и оценки ситуации на оккупированной палестинской территории. Признательна делегация Алжира за инициативу по созыву сегодняшнего заседания в связи с последними событиями в Газе. Последний раз мы обсуждали ситуацию там 2 недели назад. Очевидно, что мы должны делать это чаще. Ведь тезис о том, что ситуация в секторе и в целом в регионе продолжает стремительно деградировать, уже приобрел, к сожалению, рутинный характер и не передает того ужаса и тех страданий, с которыми ежедневно вынуждены сталкиваться мирные газовитяне, в том числе старики, женщины и дети. От наших западных коллег, прежде всего американских, повязанных круговой порукой с Израилем, ждать какого-либо сострадания к палестинцам не приходится. Поэтому доводить через площадку Совбеза ООН правду о происходящем в секторе до мировой общественности важно регулярно. Мы глубоко потрясены израильским ударом по школе Табиин в городе Газа. В это время там укрывалось более 2000 беженцев. Погибли более 100 человек, десятки получили ранения. Многие из жертв – женщины и дети. Выражаем наши искренние соболезнования родственникам погибших и желаем скорейшего выздоровления пострадавшим. Напоминаем о нашей принципиальной и последовательной позиции о необходимости неукоснительного соблюдения норм международного гуманитарного права. Призываем Западный Иерусалим воздерживаться от любых атак на гражданские объекты. Подобным действиям не может быть оправдания. К сожалению, то, что произошло в Табиин, нельзя рассматривать как отдельный эпизод или чью-то преступную оплошность. Как уже говорилось сегодня, только за последние 10 дней 13 центров в секторе Газа, где укрывались ВПЛ, подверглись бомбардировкам. По данным Управления Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека, с 4 июля израильтяне нанесли 21 удар по школам, где находились переселенцы, в результате чего погибло по меньшей мере 274 человека. Напрашивается вывод о том, что происходящее – не что иное, как сознательный выбор руководства Израиля. Осуждением конкретных акций Западного Иерусалима и призывами к сдержанности тут не обойтись. Проблема гораздо глубже. Она состоит в том, что из-за потворствования Израилю со стороны наших американских коллег Совет до сих пор так, к сожалению, и не смог выработать внятную реакцию на эскалацию кризиса на Ближнем Востоке. По сути, Совет Безопасности ООН все больше напоминает пассивного и бессильного наблюдателя, который способен лишь констатировать еще большую деградацию ситуации и ритуально выразить по этому поводу озабоченность. Скажу больше. 14 членов Совета Безопасности, по сути, оказались в заложниках у США, блокирующих любые действия в пользу немедленного прекращения огня. 10 июня, более 2 месяцев назад, Совет принял свой последний продукт по Газе. Тогда его американские авторы торопили членов Совета Безопасности как можно скорее дать ему зеленый свет, утверждая, что от этого якобы зависела судьба сделки между Хамас и Израилем по прекращению огня. Россия, напомню, тогда воздержалась, поскольку у нас были самые серьезные сомнения в реализуемости этой резолюции. Как показало время, все эти сомнения подтвердились. Сейчас наши западные коллеги предпочитают об этом не вспоминать, но резолюция 2735 содержала 3 фазы с крайне амбициозными планами, от всеобъемлющего прекращения огня до начала масштабной реконструкции сектора Газа. Ни одна из этих фаз не материализовалась. Сейчас все они выглядят абсолютно сюрреалистично. И под этим сюрреализмом, к сожалению, подписался Совет Безопасности ООН. Но хуже всего то, что он подписался под откровенной ложью, утверждением в первом оперативном параграфе, что Израиль согласился с предложенными условиями сделки. Его представители неоднократно, в том числе в этом зале, прямо заявляли, что ни на что не соглашались. Более того, вся риторика израильских официальных лиц свидетельствует о том, что Израиль в принципе не намерен прекращать свою военную операцию вне зависимости от позиции Совета Безопасности ООН. В частности, израильский министр финансов Смотрич назвал обменную сделку капитуляцией перед Яхьей Синваром, а министр нацбезопасности Бен-Гвир прямо заявил, что прекращения войны не будет. Какой же результат породила, цитирую наших американских коллег, их напористая дипломатия на земле по выведению сторон на договоренности, в которую Совет Безопасности ООН призывали не вмешиваться? Даже фраза «гора родила мышь» была бы преувеличением. Нам вообще ни о каких подвижках не известно. Кроме того, что с момента принятия резолюции 2735 единственный антирезультат – это вопиющее провокационное убийство главного переговорщика Хамас на опосредованных переговорах Исмаила Хании, бывшего палестинского премьер-министра, в ходе его визита в Тегеран. Теперь весь мир застыл в тревожном ожидании нового витка эскалации в регионе. А Соединенные Штаты Америки, которые до сих пор даже пальчиком не погрозили Израилю, лицемерно призывают всех надавить на Хамас, чтобы он принял участие в переговорах 15 августа, как будто все зависит только от Хамас. Господин председатель, даже стороннему наблюдателю сегодня очевидно, что попытки подменить полноценное решение палестино-израильского конфликта различного рода сделками века при единоличном коспонсорстве США оказались не только безуспешными, но и контрпродуктивными. Весь ближневосточный регион полыхает и находится на краю пропасти широкомасштабной войны. Первостепенная задача, безусловно, скорейшее прекращение кровопролития в секторе Газа. Россия с самого начала обострения в зоне палестино-израильского конфликта призывала Совет принять самые решительные меры для обеспечения немедленного и безусловного прекращения огня. Я напомню, мы предложили первый проект резолюции с таким требованием еще 16 октября прошлого года. Сколько жизней можно было бы спасти, если бы Совет тогда не проявил малодушие? Это не риторический вопрос, есть конкретная цифра. 40 тысяч погибших, в том числе более 200 сотрудников БАПОР, более 90 тысяч раненых. Как сегодня уже говорилось, более 2500 погибших только с момента принятия резолюции 2735. Именно столько стоит бездействие многосторонней дипломатии и конъюнктурные интересы отдельных членов СБ, которые своим дамокловым вето полгода не позволяли даже намекнуть в документах Совета Безопасности на прекращение огня. Но без прекращения военных действий невозможно положить конец страданиям ни в чем не повинных мирных палестинцев, добиться освобождения заложников и задержанных, а также обеспечить полноценный и беспрепятственный гумдоступ в анклав. Призываем Совет не идти на поводу у Вашингтона, который озабочен лишь защитой интересов Израиля и прибылью от поставок оружия в горячие точки. И вновь сообща подумать, какие меры Совет Безопасности мог бы принять для деэскалации в Газе и в регионе в целом. Если для этого необходим визит Совета Безопасности на земле, то его нужно провести. Иначе складывается странная ситуация, когда мы все ожидаем от профильных подразделений секретариата активного присутствия в зоне конфликта и выполнения их мандатов в условиях, сопряженных с рисками для их жизней, а сами, заседая в Нью-Йорке, довольствуемся информацией из их докладов и открытых источников. Или же получаем приглашение посетить Женеву вместо тех регионов, где мы действительно нужны. Ближний Восток должен быть приоритетным направлением для визитов Совета, которые не должны превращаться в политический туризм в комфортных локациях. Требует повторного рассмотрения и вопрос о том, каким образом можно было бы переформатировать присутствие на земле профильных миссий, прежде всего органа ООН, по наблюдению за соблюдением условий перемирия. Нужно осмыслить возможность усиления его мандата, если надо, вне привязки к согласию обеих сторон. Очевидно, что оно никогда не будет получено. Генерал Патрик Гаша уже дважды брифинговал Совет, очерчивал конкретные практические вопросы, которые необходимо решить для того, чтобы вдохнуть в мандат его миссии новую жизнь, что крайне востребовано в условиях текущей эскалации. Призываем коллег по Совету не сидеть сложа руки, а активно вовлекаться в эту дискуссию. Совет не может и не должен закрывать глаза на происходящее на Ближнем Востоке и в угоду одной делегации пренебрегать своим непосредственным мандатом по поддержанию международного мира и безопасности. Как и забывать о своих собственных решениях о необходимости создания независимого суверенного палестинского государства в границах 1967 года со столицей в Восточном Иерусалиме, сосуществующим в мире и безопасности с Израилем. И никакие иные схемы и концепции не должны подменять эти основы ближневосточного урегулирования. Готовы к взаимодействию со всеми, кто разделяет эти подходы. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank Undersecretary Rosemary Carlo and Director Lisa Dotin for the herring briefings today. Malta condemns the horrific strike on the Al Tabeen school in Gaza last weekend, which reportedly killed dozens of civilians, including children. This is a continuation of the deeply concerning pattern of strikes on Palestinian education facilities. Al Tabeen school was a refuge for hundreds of displaced Palestinians. We urge Israel to cease attacks on civilians and civilian objects and to take immediate, decisive action to adhere to international human rights and humanitarian law. It is unacceptable that the civilian casualties of this war have reached 40,000, and by some estimates may be as high as 180,000, and that several hostages, including children, remain captive in Gaza for 312 days. Innocent lives on both sides should be safeguarded at all costs. The status quo reflects an apparent complete disregard for international law as the modus operandi of the conflict parties. Hamas's use of the civilian infrastructure for militant purposes, including through the firing of rockets into Israel, directly jeopardizes civilians, which we wholly condemn, and as we have consistently condemned the terror attacks, including those of 7th October. Nonetheless, strict compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, remains a paramount obligation of the conflict parties, including Israel. The principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution are not voluntary. The lives of civilians, women and children cannot be disregarded. Malta condemns the loss of all innocent civilian life, including the recent killing of Druze children in Majd al-Shams, and we stress the conflict parties' obligation to prioritize protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. President, the broad and systematic risks faced by Gaza's population remain severe. humanitarian aid continues to be blocked without any legitimate administrative or bureaucratic reason. Hunger, the growing threat of diseases such as polio, exacerbated by little to no access to medical aid, persistent displacement and lawlessness have deepened insecurity, rendering the situation untenable. Humanitarian actors continue to inform us that what is being done to address these horrific conditions is nowhere close to enough. A paradigm shift is necessary. Border crossings must be reopened, and effective measures need to be taken to ensure that aid is delivered into and across Gaza. President, the carnage must stop. Hostages must be released. They must be reunited with their families, and the humanitarian crisis must be adequately addressed. The full, immediate, and effective implementation of relevant Council resolutions and the orders of the ICJ is essential. Malta reaffirms its categorical call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We fully support and commend efforts by the US, Egypt, and Qatar, who continue work towards bridging gaps to implement the framework agreement, which is in line with Council Resolution 2735. We call on the conflict parties to constructively approach negotiations and urgently implement the ceasefire deal. As regional escalations continue, we underline that concluding this deal is critical. This will directly contribute to avoiding a broader conflict in the Middle East. We call on all regional parties to commit to diplomacy, de-escalate and refrain from any attacks which would inflame regional tensions and undermine chances for a ceasefire deal. For Israelis and Palestinians to know security and peace, a return to restorative dialogue towards a political horizon must become the core objective. Malta stresses that this must align with a comprehensive peace plan which paves the way towards a credible and irreversible realization of the two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. La Suisse salue la convocation de cette séance urgente du Conseil de sécurité sur la situation à Gaza. Et je voudrais remercier la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires politiques, Madame Rosemary Di Carlo, et la directrice de la division du financement et des partenariats, Madame Lisa Dotin d'OCHA, pour leurs interventions. Leur appel est clair. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse condamne les violations du droit international humanitaire commises par toutes les parties. Elle condamne également le fait que les hostilités continuent de faire de nombreuses victimes civiles, comme ce fut rapporté samedi passé à Gaza. Une école est un lieu d'enseignement. Une école doit permettre aux enfants d'apprendre, de s'épanouir, de construire leur avenir et de contribuer ainsi à une société pacifique et prospère. À Gaza, aujourd'hui, les écoles sont souvent le dernier recours pour trouver quelque chose à manger, de l'eau ou un abri. Or, même les écoles sont devenues des abris de fortune, n'offrent souvent pas de refuge aux civils. D'après le Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, l'attaque israélienne sur l'école Tabin a tué au moins 93 personnes et représente la 21e attaque en un seul mois contre une école qui servait de refuge. Selon cette même source, les attaques contre des écoles, des universités, des enseignantes et enseignants et des étudiants sont en hausse. Alors, et on l'a entendu, qu'en même temps, plus d'un demi-million d'enfants n'ont plus été à l'école depuis le 7 octobre. Le droit international humanitaire interdit, y compris aux groupes armés tels que le Hamas, d'utiliser la présence de civils dans le but de protéger un objectif militaire d'une attaque. Mais même quand cette règle est violée, cela ne suspend en rien l'obligation d'Israël de se conformer strictement au droit international humanitaire dans la conduite des hostilités. Cela comprend les principes de distinction, de précaution et de proportionnalité. Israël, en tant que puissance occupante, est tenu de fournir à la population les besoins humanitaires de base, y compris un abri sûr. Monsieur le Président, il y a 75 ans, hier, les conventions de Genève ont vu le jour. En adoptant ces conventions, les États membres se sont engagés à préserver l'humanité, même en temps de guerre. Ces engagements doivent être mis en œuvre urgemment et par toutes les parties au conflit. Et ce n'est pas le cas aujourd'hui.
Les parties doivent respecter le droit international et ainsi contribuer à atténuer les souffrances des civils. La situation humanitaire à Gaza reste insoutenable. Au risque de mourir à cause des combats s'ajoutent les multiples déplacements, la perte de l'abri, les maladies et la famine. La résurgence de la polio montre l'ampleur du désastre. La polio est incurable. La prévention est donc la seule solution. À cette fin, la campagne de vaccination de l'ONU et de ses partenaires doit être rendue possible sans délai pour éviter une autre catastrophe parfaitement évitable. La famine continue à s'installer à Gaza. La Suisse rappelle que l'usage de la famine comme méthode de guerre contre la population civile est interdit et constitue un crime de guerre d'après le statut de Rome. L'acheminement immédiat, sûr et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire destinée à tous les civils qui en ont besoin à travers l'ensemble de la bande de Gaza doit enfin être garanti. Les récentes remarques du ministre des Finances israélien sont inacceptables et nous attendons du gouvernement israélien qu'il respecte ses obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse exige la mise en œuvre pleine et entière des résolutions de ce Conseil, notamment des résolutions 2712, 2720, 2728 et 2735, ainsi que des mesures provisionnelles de la Cour internationale de justice. La guerre et la souffrance à Gaza doivent cesser et tous les otages doivent être libérés immédiatement et inconditionnellement. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties à s'engager de bonne foi dans les pourparlers de cessez-le-feu sous l'égide des États-Unis, du Qatar et de l'Égypte. Un cessez-le-feu à Gaza est aussi crucial en vue d'une désescalade régionale. La solution à 2 États démocratiques, Israël et Palestine, dont Gaza fait partie intégrante, vivant côte à côte en paix à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues, reste indispensable pour la paix. C'est le seul horizon politique envisageable pour garantir la sécurité et dignité des populations dans la région et pour que les écoles redeviennent ce qu'elles devraient être, un lieu d'enseignement et d'espoir pour un futur en paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representatives of Switzerland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie Rosemary Di Carlo ainsi que Lisa Dotin pour leurs interventions. À Gaza, comme l'a exprimé à plusieurs reprises le président de la République Emmanuel Macron, la guerre doit s'arrêter pour les Gazaouis, pour les otages, pour la stabilité de la région qui est aujourd'hui en jeu. Dans ce contexte, la France condamne avec la plus grande fermeté la frappe israélienne qui a visé le 9 août l'école Al-Tabin dans la ville de Gaza. Elle adresse ses condoléances aux proches des victimes et ses pensées solidaires aux blessés. Depuis plusieurs semaines, des bâtiments scolaires où se réfugient des centaines de déplacés ont été touchés avec un nombre de victimes civiles intolérable. Ces attaques contre des infrastructures civiles doivent cesser. La France rappelle que le respect du droit international humanitaire s'impose à tous, y compris à Israël. La France souligne l'urgence d'instaurer un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent dans la bande de Gaza pour mettre fin aux souffrances de la population civile et pour permettre l'acheminement massif et sans entrave de l'aide humanitaire en réponse aux besoins immenses de la population civile de Gaza. Elle réitère son appel à la libération immédiate et sans condition de tous les otages, ainsi que sa condamnation dans les termes les plus forts des attaques terroristes commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023. Comme elle l'a rappelé hier, aux côtés de l'Allemagne et du Royaume-Uni, la France soutient les efforts de médiation des États-Unis, de l'Égypte et du Qatar. Elle appelle à la reprise immédiate des négociations. Elles doivent aboutir sans aucun délai supplémentaire. Elle condamne tout acte de provocation. Et elle appelle à cet égard le gouvernement israélien à prendre toutes les mesures nécessaires pour faire respecter le statu quo historique sur les lieux saints à Jérusalem. La France réaffirme l'urgence de mettre en œuvre la solution des 2 États, seule à même de garantir la stabilité et la sécurité de tous dans la région. Face à la montée des tensions au Moyen-Orient, ce Conseil doit tout faire pour éviter un embrasement régional. Et la France est attachée à la stabilité régionale, à la sécurité de ses partenaires dans la région. Nous sommes mobilisés en faveur d'une désescalade rapide en lien avec nos partenaires internationaux. La France exprime sa profonde inquiétude quant à la poursuite des affrontements le long de la ligne bleue entre Israël et le Liban. Elle réitère son plein soutien à la FINUL, dont l'action est indispensable, Et dans ce contexte, elle proposera prochainement à ce Conseil un projet de résolution renouvelant le mandat de la force pour 12 mois. Monsieur le Président, nous appelons toutes les parties à la plus grande responsabilité, à la plus grande retenue, afin de prévenir tout embrasement régional qui aurait des conséquences dévastatrices pour l'ensemble de la région. L'Iran et ses alliés doivent s'abstenir de toute attaque qui aggraverait encore les tensions régionales, qui compromettrait la possibilité de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu et à la libération des otages. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor presidente, agradezco a la secretaria general adjunta Di Carlo y a la directora Dotin por los informes que han proporcionado al Consejo. Mi país reitera su apoyo a la valiosa y sacrificada labor de Naciones Unidas y sus agencias en la zona de conflicto. Han transcurrido ya más de 10 meses desde el inicio de esta guerra, más de 10 meses de violencia, de muerte y desolación, más de 10 meses de noticias desoladoras, y el pasado fin de semana no ha sido la excepción. El bombardeo de una escuela en Gaza ha provocado nuevamente la muerte de decenas de civiles palestinos, muchos de ellos desplazados, varias veces buscando en vano algo de seguridad y protección. La enorme cantidad de muertos y heridos civiles que ha provocado esta guerra hacen difícil estar en desacuerdo con quienes han dicho que el pueblo palestino enfrenta un castigo colectivo, como han afirmado el secretario general Guterres y varios líderes mundiales. Entre tanto, más de 110 rehenes siguen en poder de Hamas, luego de más de 300 días de cautiverio que iniciaron con los injustificables ataques terroristas del 7 de octubre. Esos ataques, cabe recordar, constituyen la causa inmediata de la violencia actual y no pueden dejar de condenarse, como mi país lo hace nuevamente en esta ocasión. Cada día que pasa, son los civiles quienes siguen soportando el peso de este conflicto en medio del horror, el desplazamiento y el sufrimiento sin fin, como ha señalado correctamente el coordinador especial Thor Wennesland. Cada día que pasa, también crece la amenaza de un conflicto regional que solo provocaría más muertos, más desplazamientos y más sufrimiento para las poblaciones civiles. Paradójicamente, en que apenas ayer conmemoramos 75 años de los convenios de Ginebra. En definitiva, es urgente un acuerdo que permita detener esta guerra, liberar a los rehenes, aliviar la terrible situación humanitaria en Gaza y dejar sin pretextos a quienes desean más violencia. Señor presidente, el pasado 8 de agosto, los líderes de Qatar, Egipto y Estados Unidos emitieron un comunicado conjunto en el que llaman a las partes a retomar los diálogos este jueves 15 y finalizar sin demora un acuerdo. Mi país agradece a los 3 países mediadores por su liderazgo y su esfuerzo y exhorta a las partes a aceptar este llamado y aprovechar esta oportunidad demostrando voluntad política y buena fe. Solo así será posible concluir, por fin, la negociación del acuerdo e iniciar su implementación sin más demoras, tal como pidió este Consejo con la resolución 2735. Mientras tanto, todos los actores regionales que desean la paz deben ejercer el máximo de contención y evitar cualquier acción o medida que pueda afectar las negociaciones. Es tiempo ya de hacer un verdadero esfuerzo colectivo por la paz. Es tiempo de acciones y actitudes concretas que contribuyan a cambiar la cruenta realidad actual. Es tiempo de acuerdos y de contención. Concluyo esta intervención, señor presidente, con la esperanza de que la próxima vez que el Consejo trate este tema, las hostilidades hayan cesado y sea posible avanzar hacia una solución pacífica, negociada, definitiva y justa para las partes, con la existencia de dos estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes, única manera de terminar definitivamente este conflicto. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. I thank USG Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and Director Lisa Dotin for their important briefings and call to action, particularly in the statement of Director Lisa Dotin, to leave no stone unturned. I welcome the participation of the representatives of the State of Palestine, Israel, and South Africa in this meeting. After weeks of sustained escalation amidst continued violence in the Gaza Strip and the wider region, it is tragic to hear another report of a direct attack on the Al-Tabin school located in central Gaza, a place where hundreds of displaced Palestinian civilians found shelter. We know that in the press release, the Israeli Defense Forces stated that following intelligence, the Israeli Air Force precisely struck a Hamas command and control center embedded in the Al-Tabin school, located adjacent to a mosque, which serves as a shelter for the residents in Gaza City. Sierra Leone deeply regrets that over 80 civilians were killed, including a family of 10 persons, and that many more were injured. We deplore this tragic and unacceptable loss of civilian lives and the actions that led to such devastating consequences. We reiterate our condemnation of attacks on honor schools, civilian objects, including residential areas, providing shelter to innocent civilians, in particular women and children. We call for an immediate end to indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and violations of international law. Colleagues, as reported by the UN Human Rights Office in the occupied Palestinian territory, the unfolding pattern in the recent weeks of direct strikes on schools in the Gaza Strip is unacceptable and cannot be justified under any circumstances. The UN Human Rights Office has also reported that over the past months, 17 schools have been struck, killing at least 163 Palestinians, including women and children. In the span of 10 months, each day has brought new challenges, struggles, and hardship for the affected civilians who have witnessed and endured prolonged suffering. The humanitarian situation remains a crisis of epic proportions, as the supply of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip remains challenging due to access constraints and the high level of insecurity. Civilians are not only struggling to access basic amenities such as food, water, and medication, but are also at risk of a surge in communicable diseases due to overcrowding and poor living conditions. Recently, the World Health Organization has confirmed the high risk of poliovirus spreading within Gaza Strip due to the unsanitary condition in the confined space. As stated by a WHO expert, an outbreak of poliovirus in the Gaza Strip may spill over internationally at a very high point. We therefore call for the safe facilitation of unobstructed access into and within Gaza through all crossing points for all vaccinations, associated equipment, including cold chain storage, and specialist staff. The well-being and health of children require far greater input than just vaccinations, and we reiterate our call for unimpeded access for all humanitarian activities. It is heartrending at this stage to recount the series of threats and devastations civilians face in the Gaza Strip. While people still struggle to have an average proportion of a square meal per day and access to basic health care, there are also warnings of potential flooding ahead of the winter season. Humanitarian experts in the field have highlighted that the repeated evacuation orders by Israel since the start of the conflict has been carried out in a manner that fails to prioritize the safety and well-being of civilians, as they fail to meet the international humanitarian law criteria. Colleagues, on the wider region, the situation remains fragile as hostilities continue across the blue line in Lebanon. The Houthis continue their maritime attacks in the Red Sea, and a potential attack on Israel territory as a possible retaliation from Iran cannot be discounted. The West Bank is no exception, as there is an increase in attacks and civilian casualties. With the war in wider Middle East regional context, I would like to conclude with the following observations. Firstly, the cumulative toll of the conflict makes it even more essential at this stage to find a peaceful resolution. This can be achieved with an immediate ceasefire, release of hostages, followed by parties to the conflict, that is, Israel and Hamas, complying with the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in South Africa versus Israel case, and the Security Council resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Secondly, in adhering to the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, civilian objects, including schools, cannot be legitimate military target, as well as cannot be used for any military purpose. Thirdly, and despite the stalemate, Leone remains supportive of ongoing diplomatic engagement, which, in our considered view, is one of the effective tools to resolving this conflict. We once again call on the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, to foster an environment of constructive dialogue to rebuild trust and confidence. Since SCR 2735 was adopted, over 2,303 civilians have been killed. This cannot continue, as we know that the deaths have added to the 287 aid workers killed in Gaza Strip since 7th October 2023, including 205 UNRWA staff, and at least 39,699 Palestinians killed, and over 91,722 injured. In this regard and in closing, we call on all sides to take steps to urgently finalize the deal being brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, in line with Resolution 2735. The parties must demonstrate good faith. To sustain diplomatic effort and negotiations, it is hoped that the collective conscience will rule over actions of the parties and guide them towards doing what is right and just, as against what they so desperately desire. I thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. I give the floor to the representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, as we gather here for the 10th month in a row to advance a ceasefire to save human lives, Israel continues taking human lives and every action possible to spread a wildfire across the Middle East. As we sit here on the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions that were birthed in the ruins of entire cities, in the mass and indiscriminate killing of civilians, in the death chambers in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as a pledge that the light will emerge out of the darkest night and protect the dignity and humanity of all persons caught in armed conflict, Israel is tearing the conventions apart in Gaza, along with every rule humanity has ever elaborated. As we meet here in New York, there are Israeli government and military officials, pundits, and analysts explaining seriously that they are entitled to carry out indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks against the Palestinian civilian population, to wage war against civilians. They explain that starvation is a legitimate weapon of war. They justify gang rape and torture against defenseless prisoners as a required deterrent. And this is not a theoretical exercise. This is what Israel is imposing against millions of Palestinians, no man, woman, or child spared. You demand Israel to stop killing civilians as a Security Council, but it targets them in their shelters and tents. You demand Israel to allow food and medicine in, but it ensures that famine and diseases spread. You demand Israel to treat Palestinian prisoners humanely, but it tortures them and allows the Israeli jailers to rape and abuse their Palestinian hostages. You call on it to stop its settlements, but it rapidly accelerates its colonization of Palestinian land. You urge Israel to uphold the historic status quo at the holy sites, but its ministers and settlers desecrate the Al-Haram al-Sharif each time more openly and provocatively. So let me state the obvious. Israel does not care about your condemnations. Let me repeat. Israel does not care about your condemnations. It dismisses your resolutions. It does not even listen to your debates. Their representative will be playing with his iPhone while you are talking. As countries, as a Security Council, you had a responsibility to act months ago to stop this impunity. As the genocide continues, you have a responsibility to react, to save human lives, and preserve the foundations for peace and security for all, not just for some. Israel is a rogue state with a rotten government due to the unbridled impunity it has enjoyed so far. I have no doubt that the tides will turn, and we will not be deterred in making sure no one can act as if Palestinians' lives are worthless. But Palestinians in Gaza cannot wait for the tide to turn. Their agony must stop now, must stop right now. They wonder if you see them. Do you ever think, what if you were born in Gaza? What if the prisoner raped was your son? What if the children starving to death were your own? What if that woman killed was your daughter or your wife? What if the disease was riddling the body of your mother, your grandmother? What if that family that was blown into pieces or burned to death was yours? Killed in cold blood after running in desperation and hunger for months to survive. Just consider for one moment the sheer agony and despair that our people have suffered all these long months of deprivation and devastation lashed upon them while the world watched and left them to suffer, starve, and die. Mr. President, while we acknowledge and welcome the international consensus that has long called for an immediate ceasefire, clearly Israel has retained a veto right over that prospect. This must be brought to an end. Israel cannot continue to defy the world and every rule of humankind. It is not a coincidence. Every time the world pushes for a ceasefire, Israel responds with a massacre, like the one in the school. It sends a message, each more gruesome than the one before, that it will not stop. But there is no right to commit genocide. Obviously, no right. And we warn all those contributing directly or indirectly to the emergence of such a right. There is nothing that can justify Israeli actions. Nothing. And don't anyone dare say this is about the hostages. It's not about the hostages. It became apparent long ago that this Israeli government could care less about them. The hostages know it. Their families know it. You know it in the Security Council. Israel is killing them, abandoning them, playing with their lives. Netanyahu has other priorities, self-serving ones, maniacal ones. He's a maniac. Something terrible is happening in Israel. Something that has made justifying genocide, famine, and gang rape mainstream ideology. Something horrific is happening. The memory of the Holocaust, instead of serving as an unbreachable barrier against the commission of atrocities, has been instrumentalized to justify their commission. How is this possible? 10 months later, with the whole world opposed to it, because that opposition has yet to lead to serious consequences for Israel. This is a hard fact. You have to face it. If there are no consequences, they're not going to stop. They're not going to listen to you. To those who continue to arm Israel, to those who still have the audacity to call in Israel, quote unquote, to investigate its own crimes, as if the actions of its soldiers do not reflect the actual policies of its military and political leaders. To those who dare to try and deter international courts from ensuring accountability instead of deterring the perpetrators of atrocities. Wake up. Wake up. How long do you have to remain in denial? Wake up. Stop finding excuses. Stop imagining that you can reason with the Israeli government so it stops killing civilians by the thousands, imposing famine, torturing prisoners, colonizing and annexing our land. All while you appeal to them, call on them, demand them to stop. You have to tell them to stop, and you have the tools to make them stop. As a Security Council and as nations in your national capacity. You have to decide, what do you stand for and what do you stand against? This is not a time for justifications and equivocations. This is a time for clarity and resolve. This is time to shore up principles and morality. Do not abandon your duties. Do not abandon your duties as a Security Council. You have the tools to make what you decide a reality, and no one should be above the law. if you choose to do that, if you have the political will to implement what you decide. Mr. President, when will the Israeli government be held accountable for its actions? When? When will the war criminals be sanctioned? And as my brother from Algeria, it is time to sanction. We reject a position whereby you would be against hostage-taking except when the hostages are Palestinians, and whereby you would sanction war criminals except when they are Israelis. We cannot come back here over and over again and pretend that everyone does not all know that Israel will not listen until it has no choice but to listen. You have to make them have no choice but to listen to you until there are consequences for its crimes. You cannot commit a crime and get away with it. There has to be consequences for those committing crimes, for those who want to defend the four Geneva Conventions and all the conventions' elements. When in Article 1 it says that you have to ensure in all times the compliance with the provisions of the conventions. And you see them getting away with murder, and you keep repeating the same thing. When are you going to enforce your decisions and international law? You need to impose sanctions on those criminals. You do that, they will stop continuing to commit these crimes and atrocities and genocide against the Palestinian people. We reject a position whereby you would be against hostage-taking, as I said, except when the hostages are Palestinians, and whereby you would sanction war criminals except when they are Israelis. We cannot come back here over and over again and pretend that everyone does not know that Israel will not listen until it has no choice but to listen until there are consequences for its crimes. Palestinians are exhausted, surrounded by death and endless horrors, and they know your words are so that they know that your words are no match for the bombs and bullets taking away their lives and limbs. But words are not all this council has. Words are not the only tool your countries have. Some have gone beyond words. They are too rare. This is a time to act, as a number of you have stated. And you will be judged, not only for the eloquence of your speeches, but also, and more importantly, for the courage of your actions. Show some courage. Show some bravery. Take actions. Stop the criminals in getting away with murder. Mr. President, we don't want Israel to torture our prisoners a bit less. As some say, that torture them a bit less. We want to see them free. We don't want Israel to make its occupation a bit less brutal. We want to see it end. Our people deserve freedom. The International Court of Justice has been unequivocal in its determination that, and I quote, the sustained abuse by Israel of its positions as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control over the occupied Palestinian territory and continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israelis' presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful. Their presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful. Therefore, the court said it has to end as quickly as possible. This illegal occupation and all the illegal, inhumane, racist, and destructive policies that flow from it must end. The Palestinian people will not disappear, and they will not surrender. They will not relinquish their legitimate aspiration to live in freedom and dignity in their ancestral land. I urge the Security Council to act. I urge you to act. And in the coming days, we will go to the General Assembly to make sure that it upholds its charter responsibilities to make sure that the determinations of the highest court in the world, the ICJ, is translated into political will and momentum, into concrete actions to be pursued by the UN and its member states to end this illegal action as soon as possible. To protect civilians' lives, to preserve and pursue peace and security. Dag Hammarskjöld once stated, and I quote, "It has been said that the United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but in order to save us from hell." End of quotation. History will remember that the Palestinians were left to endure hell. Now, the fire they have painfully endured for almost a year is spreading to devour everything around in our region. There is only one way to stop a man-made fire. It is not enough to tend to the flames. You need to stop the arsonist. Let me repeat what our people in Gaza is saying, and they have been saying that, and they cannot take it any longer. Enough is enough. You have to act to put an end to this cruel criminality and genocide against our people in Palestine, particularly in the Gaza Strip. Will you do that? All of you? You gave beautiful statements. You said, you showed unanimity in rejecting their criminal action. But that is good, not sufficient. Show the will and the resolve to act on that basis with the tools that you have, with the mandate given to you by the Charter, to come to the Palestinian people and serve them justice, to stop the criminals from continuing in what they are doing. Can we count on you? Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the observer states of Palestine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm sure many of you were not aware or did not care to check, but today is Tisha B'Av, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, our ancient day of mourning. We are fasting today for the many tragedies in Jewish history that occurred on this day, including the destruction of our first and second holy temples in Jerusalem. But let me be clear, Jerusalem will never fall again. Jerusalem, united Jerusalem, will never fall again. No matter how many times our enemies attempt to destroy us, no matter how many times the UN slanders us and distorts reality. We will stay in our homeland and we will prevail. Mr. President, Council members, in the early hours of October 17th, 2023, reports flooded from Hamas Ministry of Health of an Israeli airstrike on Al-Ahli Hospital. You probably remember it. Remember that day. These reports were then very quickly, parroted by UN officials, media outlets, and several governments. Not even 24 hours following these baseless claims, this council convened to discuss what was exposed to be a terrorist propaganda operation. As you probably remember, it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket which fell on the hospital parking lot, not an Israeli missile. Fast forward 10 months, and nothing has changed. In the early hours of August 10th, 2024, the Gaza Ministry of Health, which the OCHA representative referenced while failing to mention it is in fact Hamas, has concocted a new blood libel. Once again, UN officials and media outlets were quick to echo this campaign of lies. I simply cannot comprehend that the United Nations Security Council would hold an emergency session based on jihadist propaganda. Once again, the Council falls for terrorist narratives, amplifying them and neglecting its obligations to the truth. Some in this chamber distort reality because of political interest, and we all understand the political interest. So I will set the record straight for all of you. On Saturday, August 10th, Israel targeted not a school, not an innocent school. We targeted dangerous terrorists operating in a Hamas command and control center within El Taba'in school. As usual, Hamas cynically abuses civilian facilities which should be protected as their terror bases. This strike eliminated at least 31 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists who carried out attacks from inside this compound. These vile terrorists included platoon commanders, mortar and rocket operatives, cell commanders, and intelligence operatives. We neutralized dozens of vicious terrorists who used this school for their evil goals and were in direct violation of international law. But do you hold Hamas accountable for the losses? No, of course not. And of course he shouldn't speak for Hamas because he doesn't represent them. How convenient. By the way, the building itself is still intact, which would be physically impossible if Hamas claims are to be believed. So I ask you, dear colleagues, did you learn nothing from Hamas's lies about Al-Ahli Hospital or from their lies about Al-Shifa Hospital, which they also used as their headquarters, and the lies about our daring hostage rescue, among many other instances? In which other context would the international community rush to propagate the lies of a terrorist organization attempting to malign a democratic state, as we take every possible measure to minimize collateral damage, while Hamas uses civilians as human shields, deliberately putting them in harm's way? Not only are Hamas lies echoed here, but you also ignore and enable their outrageous violations of international and humanitarian law. Prohibited use of civilian infrastructure by Hamas terrorists are numerous, are widespread, Everyone, I'm telling you, everyone can see them. Everyone except the UN, of course. Yet, the briefer today only touched upon these violations rather than investigating the twisted and immoral strategies of Hamas terrorists. But why would we be surprised if the UN has no data of itself? They have to rely on baby killers and rapers to supply them the data. Just 80 years ago, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, used the language of race science as his weapon against the Jewish people, poisoning the minds of the German people. Mr. President, Joseph Goebbels' ilk, the people who are ideologically his descendants, are alive and well, sadly. Only now it is Hamas using the language of humanitarian and international law and modern blood libels to vilify Israel. The Council convened today urgently to discuss Hamas's false claims. Shockingly, it seems that you have decided to dedicate your time to listen to the terrorist lies, while no real concern has been shown when Israeli children were murdered only recently by Hezbollah. Let me show you the differences. These, and you have the names and their positions, these are the terrorists eliminated in Gaza on Saturday. This is only part of them because we, as a reliable country, we check ourselves. We don't rush to conclusions. But this is only part of the terrorists who were eliminated on Saturday. Terrorists exploiting Al-Taba'in school as a base for their murderous objectives. These are the people you call an emergency session for. While these are 11 of the 12 Israeli children murdered by the terrorists of Hezbollah. These children were playing a football game in Majd al-Shams when Hezbollah terrorists rained down death upon their sweet heads. So while these terrorists used a school as their terror base, these children will never see their school again. But for them, you couldn't find the time for an urgent session. They do not deserve an urgent session, huh, my Algerian colleague? Shame on you. What a disgrace. So ask yourself, why was the murder of 12 Israeli children in Majd al-Shams insufficient cause for a meeting, but the elimination of Palestinian terrorists operating out of a school is sufficient? But you know what? The most unbelievable thing is your inaction to condemn and stop the biggest danger and threat to the entire region. Iran. Right now, as we speak here now, millions of Israelis are preparing for a direct Iranian attack, just as they did in April. Iran's aggression threatens the entire region with war, a regional war. Yet you are here wasting time on falsehoods spread by the words of terrorists. This fact that we are holding an emergency session because Hamas uses civilians as human shields rather than discussing the real global threat perfectly represents the distorted agenda within the UN, a significant detachment between the UN's supposed agenda and the global reality. Colleagues, as this may be the last time for me to address you as Israel's ambassador, though who knows, perhaps another session will be called because of more terrorist propaganda, I would like to leave you with this. I have been immensely, immensely proud to represent my country here, the most moral country in the world, the most moral country in the world. You listen, Palestinian representative. in this warped place. I hope one day you will also see the bias and perversion of morality here, and I pray that you will see the truth. The terrorist organization that this guy represents here and tyrannical regimes should be condemned, not protected, and that Israel should be praised. We are today the vanguard of civilization. We are the vanguard of civilization. But until then, Am Israel Chai. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. The representative of Algeria has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Très brièvement, je voudrais témoigner ici que les 16 000 enfants tués depuis le 7 octobre dernier ne se sont pas suicidés. Je voudrais témoigner ici que les plus de 10 000 femmes massacrées ne se sont pas suicidées. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their further statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, thank you for giving us the opportunity to participate in this urgent meeting, which is most likely not going to be the last on the same matter, whilst civilians continue to be massacred by the implacable government of Israel. Unfortunately, some in this room continue to support and defend Israel as it commits the most despicable crimes against humanity the world has ever seen in recent times with impunity. It is indeed an indictment on the UN Security Council that a resolution has to date not been found on this intractable conflict that has served on the agenda of this organization since time immemorial. Just yesterday, lamenting the inefficiency of the Security Council, the Secretary General remarked, and I quote, "Since 1945, the United Nations Security Council has been a bedrock of global peace and security, but the cracks in its foundations are becoming too large to ignore. They are contributing to deadlock, stalemate, and stagnation around today's most pressing crises." End of quote. In this regard, the inability of the Council to put an end to the genocide that continues to be carried out by Israel against the people of Gaza is a case in point. Mr. President, Israel's impunity and apparent political protection is not perceived, it's real. This impunity puts into question the whole meaning of, and I quote, legally binding, because this organization has adopted numerous resolutions since the formation of the United Nations that have been undermined by Israel for decades. To affirm its status as a legal delinquent immediately following its receipt of armed support from those who support it, Israel committed yet another massacre on 10 August this year when it bombed the Al-Tabin school in central Gaza City, where thousands of displaced families had sheltered. More than 100 Palestinian children, women, and men, and many injured as a result. The assassination of Hamas leader, Dr. Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran last month, and the continuous targeting of civilians in Gaza will likely further compound the situation in an already volatile region. We hope that the investigation into his assassination will soon be concluded and call on all parties to exercise the utmost restraint and avoid any acts that would escalate tensions in an already fragile region. Mr. President, as an avid believer of the rule of law, in December last year, South Africa approached the International Court of Justice seeking an order to prevent Israel from committing genocide against the Palestinian people. Israel defied the court's order and launched an offensive in Rafah. Once again, South Africa put its trust in the global court system and sought additional provisional measures to prevent Israel's persistent acts of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Deciding on the matter, the court proclaimed that the Palestinians have a legal right to protection against genocide, and that South Africa had shown that there was a real and imminent risk of the irreparable violation of that right. This also fell on deaf ears. In addition to the evidence presented at the ICJ, South Africa submitted to the Security Council a body of evidence in support of its argument that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. This document was circulated as S/2024/419, and we encourage all member states to study the document and acquaint themselves of its content. Mr. President, there must be an immediate cessation of hostilities across the whole of Gaza, and all attacks on humanitarian workers and medical staff must cease immediately and permanently. The continued occupation of Palestine, destruction of infrastructure, obliteration of livelihoods, displacement, collective punishment, and extrajudicial assassinations will undoubtedly make the realization of a peaceful solution to the Palestinian question and the situation in the Middle East in general much more difficult to achieve. We reiterate that the international community cannot proclaim the importance of international law, including the respect for the UN Charter in some situations, but not in others. The ability of Israel to simply ignore binding decisions from international organizations with no consequences is unacceptable. The Council must immediately ensure respect for its resolutions in line with its mandate if it's to successfully mend, and I quote, the cracks in its foundation, end quotes, and avert a situation where these cracks become too large to ignore. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representatives of South Africa for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.